$4.5 billion. That's the size of the contract NATO just handed to a Swedish company instead of Boeing. And the timing is what makes this impossible to spin. The announcement landed the moment Air Force One touched down in Turkey for the NATO summit. Trump didn't get a briefing. He got a headline waiting for him on the tarmac the instant he stepped off the plane. 3 details explain why this snub cuts deeper than a routine defense contract. And the first one is the plane NATO chose to replace. Start with what NATO actually announced. The alliance revealed plans to buy up to 10 Saab Global surveillance aircraft, manufactured by the Swedish defense company Saab, to replace its aging fleet of Boeing AWACS planes. AWACS stands for Airborne Warning and Control System. These are the distinctive aircraft with the giant rotating radar dome mounted on top, used to track enemy aircraft and coordinate battlefield operations across the entire alliance. NATO's AWACS fleet has flown under NATO's own flag since the Cold War, one of the only aircraft types operated collectively by the alliance rather than by individual member nations. Replacing that fleet is not a minor procurement decision. It's a decision about whose technology sits at the center of NATO's shared surveillance capability for the next several decades, and NATO chose Sweden's technology over Boeing's. Here's why the timing matters as much as the decision itself. Trump landed in Ankara for the NATO summit on a Tuesday, and the Saab announcement broke the same day, effectively greeting him on arrival. There was no delay for diplomatic cushioning, no attempt to schedule the news for a quieter news cycle after the summit wrapped. The alliance's own defense procurement process simply concluded when it concluded, and the outcome became public exactly as Trump was stepping into a room full of the same allies he'd spent months pressuring to buy more American-made weapons. That pressure campaign is the second piece of context that makes this sting. Trump has made purchasing American-made defense equipment a central, repeated demand of his NATO policy. Alongside his push for member nations to raise defense spending, he has framed the two demands as connected. Allies spending more on defense should mean allies buying more American hardware, reinforcing U.S. industrial dominance in exchange for the security umbrella Washington provides. It's been one of the most consistent messages of his entire approach to the alliance. Buy American. Spend more. Buy American. NATO's own procurement arm just delivered a public counterexample in the most high-profile possible venue on the exact week those two messages were supposed to be reinforced in person. Now, it's worth understanding why Saab actually won this contract, because the explanation isn't simply allies snubbing America out of spite. The GlobalEye platform Saab offered is a genuinely newer surveillance system, built on a different aircraft body than the aging Boeing AWACS design, which traces its core airframe back to the 1970s. Newer avionics, updated radar technology, and a smaller operating cost per aircraft all factor into a procurement decision of this size. Defense analysts have noted that Saab's aircraft simply represented a more modern, more cost-efficient option on the merits, independent of any political undertone. NATO's procurement processes are also required to run competitive multi-bidder evaluations for contracts of this scale, and Boeing was reportedly not the only American company in consideration. But here's why the merits-based explanation doesn't fully neutralize the political embarrassment. A contract Boeing could have won in a competition America's own alliance was required to run fairly, went to a European competitor instead during the exact week the American president was demanding those same allies prioritize buying from American companies. Whether the loss came down to price, technology, or timing doesn't change what it looks like walking off the plane. The flagship replacement for one of NATO's most iconic aircraft types, awarded to Sweden the same day Trump arrived to ask everyone in the room to buy American. Widen the frame further, because this fits a pattern that extends well beyond one surveillance jet contract. NATO allies have spent the past year and a half increasingly diversifying their defense procurement away from exclusively American suppliers, driven partly by cost, partly by newer competing technology out of Europe and South Korea, and partly by a broader strategic hedge against relying too heavily on a single supplier whose foreign policy commitments have felt less predictable under the current administration. European nations have been explicit in public statements about wanting defense industrial independence that doesn't leave them dependent on a single ally's political mood for spare parts, upgrades, and continued support. That hedge shows up across multiple recent decisions, not just this one. Poland, Germany, and other NATO members have signed increasingly large defense agreements with each other and with non-American suppliers over the past year. South Korea's defense industry, known for efficient manufacturing and generous offset terms, has been actively marketing itself to NATO members as a viable alternative to American systems. None of these choices happen because a single country wants to embarrass a single American president on a single afternoon. They happen because purchasing decisions worth billions of dollars get made based on capability, cost, and long-term strategic reliability. And increasingly, those calculations are landing somewhere other than an American factory floor, which is precisely what makes this contract worth paying attention to as a signal rather than an isolated news story. Individually, $4.5 billion is a rounding error against the scale of NATO's total defense spending. But symbolically, it's a message written in the language Trump himself has used constantly to describe the transatlantic relationship, leverage contracts, who's paying for what, and who's buying from whom. NATO's procurement office just answered that framing with a purchase order for a European jet over an American one, delivered the moment the American president landed to make his case in person. The AWACS replacement program will take years to fully roll out, and Boeing may still compete for other pieces of the broader modernization effort NATO has planned. This single contract does not permanently settle who builds the alliance's next generation of surveillance aircraft. But the optics of this particular announcement on this particular day are not something a press statement easily undoes. Trump asked a room full of allies to buy American. Before he even reached the summit floor, one of them had already spent $4.5 billion proving they didn't have to. Look closer at what NATO is actually retiring because the history makes the substitution land harder. The alliance's AWACS fleet has operated continuously since the early 1980s, painted in NATO's own colors, rather than any single nation's markings. One of the very few military assets the alliance owns and operates collectively rather than member states operating their own under a shared command structure. For more than 4 decades, that distinctive silhouette, a Boeing airframe with a rotating radar dome bolted to the top, has been the visual shorthand for NATO's shared eyes in the sky. Replacing it isn't like a single country swapping out a fighter jet. It's replacing a piece of the alliance's own institutional identity, and for the first time in that aircraft's operational history, the replacement won't say Boeing on the fuselage. Consider what this means for Boeing specifically, because the company was already absorbing losses on multiple fronts before this contract went to a competitor. Boeing's defense division has struggled with cost overruns and delayed delivery timelines on several major government contracts in recent years, and the commercial side of the business has spent the past several quarters losing ground to Airbus in the European market, partly a consequence of the same broader trade tensions running through this story. A defense side loss of this size and visibility compounds a pattern that's become increasingly familiar to anyone tracking Boeing's order book, contract after contract, in market after market, going to a competitor instead. For a company that built much of its identity as the default supplier to NATO and the US military for the better part of a century, watching NATO itself choose Sweden is not just a lost bid, it's a lost narrative. Now put that loss inside the wider pattern of European defense industrial independence, because the Saab contract is not an outlier decision made by one procurement committee on one afternoon. Over the past 18 months, NATO member states have signed a growing list of major defense agreements that route around American suppliers entirely. Poland has deepened defense industrial cooperation with South Korea, whose manufacturers have marketed themselves aggressively to European buyers on the strength of fast production timelines and generous offset terms, arrangements where a portion of the contract value gets reinvested directly into the buying country's own industrial base, something American contractors have historically been less willing to offer. Germany has expanded submarine and naval systems partnerships with other European nations, and multiple NATO members have publicly discussed the strategic risk of depending too heavily on a single supplier whose political posture toward the alliance has felt less predictable over the past 2 years than it did in prior administrations. None of these individual decisions, taken alone, amounts to Europe abandoning American defense technology. The United States still supplies the overwhelming majority of NATO's most advanced systems, and that is unlikely to change dramatically in the near term. But taken together, the pattern describes something real, a gradual, deliberate diversification strategy driven by cost, by newer competing technology, and by a genuine strategic hedge against over-reliance on one country's manufacturing base and one country's foreign policy mood. European officials have said as much publicly, describing the push toward defense industrial independence not as anti-American sentiment but as ordinary risk management, the kind any alliance would pursue if a single supplier's reliability came into question. That's the part of the story that outlasts the headline about one surveillance jet. $4.5 billion is not, by itself, a large enough number to reshape the transatlantic defense relationship. NATO's total collective defense spending runs into the hundreds of billions annually, and Boeing remains deeply embedded across dozens of other programs throughout the alliance. But symbolism compounds. Every contract that goes to Saab or to a South Korean shipbuilder or to a German submarine manufacturer instead of an American one adds another data point to the same underlying trend line. And trend lines are exactly what capital markets, defense planners, and rival manufacturers pay closest attention to when deciding where to place their next bid, which brings the story back to the tarmac in Ankara. Trump arrived at that summit to make the same argument he's made consistently throughout his approach to NATO: spend more and spend it on American equipment. The Saab announcement did not contradict the first half of that message. NATO members have, in fact, been raising defense spending significantly. It contradicted the second half, publicly, immediately, and with a dollar figure attached. The alliance is spending more, it just isn't spending all of it on Boeing. Look at how this connects to everything else NATO members have done over the same 18-month window, because the through line becomes hard to miss once you stack the decisions next to each other. A separate NATO member's largest ever defense procurement, a submarine program worth tens of billions of dollars, went to a European shipbuilder over an Asian competitor, with American suppliers not even reaching the final round of consideration. Another member state's Air Force has publicly reviewed whether to continue with a previously signed American fighter jet order, citing the changing strategic environment as the reason for the review. None of these decisions were announced as retaliation. Each was framed individually in the dry technical language of procurement committees: better value, better technology, better long-term industrial partnership terms. But an alliance built substantially around American military-industrial dominance for 8 decades does not casually start handing multi-billion-dollar contracts to Swedish, German, and South Korean suppliers within the same year unless something underneath the relationship has genuinely shifted. And that shift did not originate with NATO's procurement offices. It originated with 2 straight years of tariff threats, trade disputes, and public statements questioning the reliability of America's security guarantees to allies who felt they had spent decades holding up their end of the bargain. Defense purchasing decisions move slowly, shaped by multi-year evaluation cycles that were already underway long before any single tariff announcement, but the direction those decisions have trended in since trade tensions escalated is not neutral. Allies who were once reliably the easiest sale in the world for American defense contractors are now running genuinely competitive processes, and genuinely competitive processes sometimes produce results the incumbent supplier doesn't like. $4.5 billion, a Swedish company's name on the next generation of NATO's most recognizable aircraft, and a president finding out about it the moment he stepped off the plane. Individually, a single lost contract. Collectively, alongside the submarines, the fighter jet reviews, and the growing list of European and Asian suppliers now winning bids that would have gone to American companies without a second thought a decade ago, it reads less like an accident of timing and more like a